Welcome to part one of the French Revolution. There'll be three parts to this. I know there would normally be just two parts for the Tuesday, Thursday class, but I'm breaking it up to make it a little easier to digest because this is a pretty complicated topic, even for a survey course in Western Civ. So what we're going to be doing today is what is known as the Ancien Regime and the causes of the French Revolution. Then we will move on. But before we get any further, it's time to see an artifact from the period. Welcome to my library and museum and study. And you'll notice today that I have white gloves on. So this is not going to be a replica I'm going to show you. For the section of the French Revolution that we are on, which is the Ancien Regime and the causes, I have one special item. It is this French naval dagger from the era of the Ancien Regime, which means the era before the Revolution. The naval dagger is 20 inches long, and as we zoom in, you can see the reason why I have my gloves on is because it still has its 24 karat gold gilding on the handle. And we know that it's from the period of before the Revolution because of the way the handle is. See, the handle has fleur-de-lis. They did not put that on weaponry after 1789. And then as you go down the blade, you can see the engraving on it. Now it has a very unique blade. It actually has three of them. So there's one side, the back side, and the other side, which means that if you get stabbed with this particular weapon, it is going to leave one really nasty hole. And so there is the scabbard that it comes with. You can see that it had a little damage to it before I bought it, and then they had to repair it, and they didn't put the gold gilding on it. So anyway, that's our little trinket for this period. We'll see what tomorrow brings. I hope you enjoyed that, and next time we'll be going to the fall of the Bastille, and I have some interesting items for you to look at then. So it's time to go into our class. Thank you. The French have been celebrating the bicentennial of the French Revolution and Napoleonic era since 1987. And there have been a lot of books, and I've just selected a couple of them that are very, very good. I really like the book, The Days of the French Revolution by Hibbert, because that's almost all primary sources. So most of the stories that I'm telling you or will be telling you about events that took place and the reaction of people will come from that. Then, of course, we have newspaper accounts from the London Times. The other two books, Twilight of the Old Order and Citizens, are two books that came out relatively close to the beginning of the bicentennial celebration, and they're good general works over, in one case, the end of the Ancien Regime, the Old Regime, and the other one, which is just kind of generally about the whole revolution. So those are I highly recommend both of those. Here are some important dates in the Ancien Regime chronology, but I want you to be aware of the fact that these are just for reference only. You don't have to remember all of these. You don't have to remember any of them. This is just a reference. I would also point out that I usually consider the Ancien Regime beginning in 1715 with the death of Louis XIV, so it didn't go quite back that far. Once Louis XV takes over, and when he takes over, he's just 5 years of age. And eventually we get to our friends Marie Antoinette and the Dauphin, Louis, who is later Louis XVI, and you see that they are married in 1770. And then 4 years later, Louis XV dies, and is succeeded by Louis XVI. And the nobles are very happy about that because Louis XVI is not a dominating character. And so they see an opportunity to take advantage of the situation. Then, of course, the American Revolution, which the French got heavily involved. When any opportunity to see the English lose, the French are there. The good old Marquis de Lafayette, 1777. And then you see the dismissal of Necker. Necker is a finance minister. There's all sorts of terrible finances going on in France. Some some of it is associated with the time period of Louis XV when he was under the regent Philippe d'Orléans, but we'll talk about that later. Ultimately, Cornwallis surrenders at Yorktown with the help of the French Navy, and then we have the peace treaty in 1783, and then another finance minister bites the dust, and then there's this diamond necklace affair. What had happened was Louis XV had made a deal with a jeweler to come up with a spectacular diamond necklace for his mistress. Then he died, and they spent a lot of money on it. The jeweler appeared before Louis XVI and offered it to him, and he tried to say, well, Louis XV had required it, but that wasn't true. Louis XVI said, we can't afford it, it's not going to happen. So what happened is one of the ladies in waiting with Marie Antoinette put a bill of sale in a pile of documents that she was to sign, and she signed them just like she would without even reading them, which is not uncommon. Then the diamond necklace was delivered in the Tuileries Palace to a woman who was dressed Marie Antoinette's cape. And they never saw her face. They just were sure that it was Marie Antoinette. It was somebody else. They ran off with it and headed off to England. But Marie Antoinette sued in court over it. They told her not to. It just made an ugly situation between the people and Marie Antoinette worse at that particular time. Well, here we have Louis XV. And Louis XV is known for his famous statement, after me, the deluge, because he believed that as the end of his life appeared, that the economic structure of France was going to collapse, and this would lead to drastic changes. He's not really such a terrible person. He is, of course, specializes for the most part in chasing women. You'll notice in this little mini biography that he did have an able statesman who unfortunately died in 1743. But the problem he had initially was when he was 5, one of his relatives was regent. That was Philippe of Orleans. And he decided that he would try this new English system of economics where you used paper money. And initially it worked out pretty well, but it became kind of like a tulip mania where it kept going up and up and up, and then it builds this huge bubble, and then it burst and everything was worthless. So a lot of people lost their money at that particular time. Part of his situation is they have less money in France. The economy is not the same with Louis XIV. And then you see that succession of wars down there. The War of the Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, which of course is the French and Indian War in North America, which is where he loses Canada, and that's kind of a blow to the country. All of this increases the economic difficulties that start leading up to the revolution, but of course the revolution doesn't occur for another 26 years. The picture that you see is the official portrait of Louis XV in his Louis XIV pose. He just doesn't have quite the stature that Louis XIV had, although those are his real legs. Louis XV had 3 important women. Here's the first one, his wife, Maria Lescheka. As you notice, she is the daughter of the dethroned King of Poland, which she was 23 years old when she married Louis XV, who was 15. She had 10 children, 8 girls, 2 boys, and unfortunately, only one of them survived to adulthood. A nice person, sweet, moderately intelligent. I always enjoy when people make these biographies and they go moderately intelligent, very much in love. But of course, after giving birth to 10 children, her form probably changed a little bit. And as you notice, she also grew more religious. So this led Louis XV to look elsewhere for some companionship. His first major mistress is, of course, our friend here, Madame de Pompadour. Jeanne Antoinette Poisson. Poisson means fish. So it's nice that she's known as the Marquise de Pompadour. And she held that position for quite some time, until Louis XV grew tired of her. Louis XV's next mistress is Madame du Barry. And this is a terrible portrait. I've tried to find better portraits of her. They're either copyrighted, or when I've been to the museum where they have a really good one, it's on loan to somebody. So I'm sorry that this is kind of a scary picture of Madame du Barry. Now, to some extent, she is actually an unusual mistress, because you notice she's the illegitimate daughter of a seamstress and tax collector. Normally, the mistresses of the kings of Europe are noble families. Sometimes noble women, noble families down on their luck, and their daughter really helps them out. To have a commoner is very unusual, and to some extent, she's trained. There was a kind of a contest. One of the gentlemen at the court said that he could take any beautiful woman and turn her into the king's mistress, and Madame du Barry is a perfectly very good example of that. And you see she lives till 1793. She is actually executed during the Reign of Terror. It was kind of a terrible thing because when she didn't go peacefully, they had to drag her across the scaffolding and she kept screaming, "They're going to hurt me, they're going to hurt me." And they did. Now, both Madame de Pompadour and Madame du Barry did not stay at Versailles in the main palace. They stayed in the Trianon. Madame de Pompadour stayed in the Trianon, which is a palace in the back. And then when Madame du Barry came in, she did not want to stay in that same building the other lady had, so they made a special one for her, which is called the Petit Trianon. With the death of Louis XV in 1774, Louis XVI came to the throne. And Louis XVI is a nice guy. I mean, you have this picture in his official robes, and it's not too bad, but he just is not a man who can make decisions. He's good at following advice, but he's really much more comfortable with the servants. He is just not a dominant power on the throne. Neither was Louis XV. So with all the problems that are going on, and you'll notice here that there's a half a century, 50 years of financial bankruptcy in France, and he couldn't figure out what course of action to take. All of them are going to revolve around having to force the nobles to pay taxes, and they just couldn't do it. Turgot, who's well known as one of the very first economists or physiocrats at that time, had some ideas, but more than likely they would have all been shot down at the very last minute because any change that required the nobles to pay taxes had to be approved by them. And probably the most positive thing for the whole country, and actually for us, is that he spent, quite frankly, the American Revolution put France over their credit limit. He spent all kinds of money involving the French government in the war with us, and of course they joined in 1778 and were successful in assisting us. Both him and Marie Antoinette in the literature from the period are treated as monsters. The problem is they weren't. They had personality flaws, but they weren't monsters. But the revolutionaries, in overthrowing them, cannot portray them as sympathetic figures. So you have to always be aware of that when you're reading literature from the revolutionary period. Here we see two things on this slide. One is the illustration of the wedding of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. And the other one is his court outfit. So he looks a lot better in his court outfit than he does in the official robes of the King of France for his official picture. His problem, he has the wrong wife. He loves her. He didn't have mistresses. She is a little spoiled. We'll talk about Marie Antoinette in a little bit. These are commemorative pieces of porcelain for the crowning of Louis XVI. Marie Antoinette. She looks so cute in these pictures. These are very early pictures of her. Actually, I believe the one on the right is her wedding picture. She was only 14 years old when she married Louis XVI. Of course, he was the Dauphin at the time, and Louis himself was age 16. And one of the problems that we have is the marriage was pretty much despised. He loved her, and she loved him. That wasn't the problem. It was politics. Austria had always been a bitter enemy of the French, and here, with a treaty, he marries one of the daughters of the Empress. So it was not well liked. And then, of course, she comes from Vienna at the Schönbrunn Palace, and she's spoiled, as are all the children of the Empress of Austria. She has no friends. She tries to become popular by having parties against parties of other people, so it looks like she's spending more money than she should. So there's all sorts of these little issues that come into play. So she is the person that everybody dislikes. Her nickname is Madame Deficit before the revolution, Madame Veto once the revolution takes place. She's renowned for her famous statement, "Let them eat cake." That's a reference to when the people were short on food. And she makes the comment on cake. You have to understand that cake is the term for bread at the palace at Versailles, because the king doesn't eat regular bread. The bread has a higher sugar content, and so it's really referred to as cake. She's not making a reference to let him eat chocolate cake or something like that. So no matter what she does, she is despised by the French people. Later pictures of her. She loved to go horseback riding, but there's one little issue that comes in early on when they're married, and that is Louis told her that they would probably not have children because he could not reproduce. Problem was, he had not been circumcised, and so he was unable to maintain an erection. The same thing had happened to Catherine the Great's husband, and it had actually happened to Joseph II, which is Marie Antoinette's brother, who became Emperor of Austria. And you actually have Joseph coming to the Versailles Palace, in disguise to try and convince Louis that there really wasn't anything to it. It wouldn't take very much, and he decided he didn't want to do that. But what happened was this. The Duke of Orleans, a gentleman who during the Revolution we'll refer to as Philip Égalité, so Philip of Orleans, knew Louis wasn't going to have any children, which meant that he would become king on the death of Louis XVI. So a few years after having been married, on the anniversary, the Duke of Orleans sent her this spectacularly carved baby cradle. And the note in the bottom of it said, just thought you'd like to have something that you're never going to use. And so she just burst into tears and collapsed on the floor. And Louis XVI came in and saw what was happening and asked her what was wrong. And so she showed him the note. He called in the doctor and was circumcised. And so they had 4 children. Now here's this beautiful picture of Marie Antoinette with her. He had 4 children. Marie Therese, the oldest child, the only one to live to adulthood. Louis Joseph was born in 1781 and died just before the Revolution. He died during the Estates General on June 1789, which of course doesn't help Louis XVI while he's trying to make decisions. Then there's Louis XVII, who was never crowned. He was born in 1785, died in 1795 in prison of neglect. And then there's Princess Sophie, who was born in 1786, but died in 1787, died in infancy. She wasn't a year old. So those are the 4 children. Here's a couple of books on Marie Antoinette. André Castelnau is an excellent French historian, particularly on the monarchs and mistresses and all sorts of other stuff. So it's an excellent book. And then there's the one by Seward, which is an excellent book as well. Then they have this other one, which is known as The Fatal Friendship by Stanley Loomis. And the picture is of the Swedish ambassador, Friesen, who is always trying to help Marie Antoinette out. There's no indication that they were ever intimate, but he certainly was infatuated with her. They were platonic lovers, if you want to go that route. Marie Antoinette is shall we say, another misunderstood individual. She may have been young and inexperienced and naive and spoiled, but she wasn't as bad as she's portrayed. And she'll put up quite a fuss when they try to put her on trial and execute her. All right, so much for the fun of the Ancien Regime. Let's see what's underpinning the collapse of the French government and the Revolution. So now we have a section where it's appropriate to take significant amount of notes, shall we say. Don't forget that if you go to Citizen Gracchus, you go to the French Revolution section, there's a static version of this slide presentation so that you can take notes easier if I happen to be going through too fast for you. So let's start with social reasons. We're going to do all of these reasons, and then we'll get to what pushed everything over the edge in 1788 and 89. Now you remember from social reasons, you see the survival of privilege. Remember there are 3 estates. There's the first estate, which is the clergy. There's the second estate, which are the nobles. And there's the third estate, which is everybody else. It's incorrect to call them peasants because that's going to include professors, business owners, industrialists. Now, you don't see the third estate here because they don't have any problems. They're not causing issues. So the first estate, let's look at the survival of privilege. The French would say that the only privilege worth having is the ability to okay being taxed. But the first estate, which is the clergy, you'll see it's divided into 2 parts. There's the high clergy, which the bishops, the cardinals, they live pretty well. They live like nobles. They are very powerful. They make money. And then there's the rest of the clergy, which are the people who are just the regular priests in the small villages and perhaps the monsignors. So you actually have within the clergy a division of France because you would have the nobles and the high clergy versus the third estate, which would be your low clergy because many of them are very poorly paid. Then you get to the second estate, which are the nobles. And you see they're divided into 2 parts. There's the old nobles, which of course are the nobles of the sword, the old families. And then, during the age of absolutes, when the French government begins putting bureaucrats in the offices, they needed to be nobles as well, but they made them titles. So the nobles of the robe are the people who purchased their titles so they could acquire and operate government offices. And then we have, along with that, the relics of feudalism. This would be for both the high clergy and the noble class. First of all, the annual rent to a lord who used to own the land. Do you ever wonder how the nobles who have land, how they made their money? If you had a large amount of land, let me give you an example. Let's say your family owned an entire county, and over the years, you sold that land off to other people. Because you were a noble, even though you sold the land away, people still have to give you an annual rent every year. And that continues as long as there's a member of that family in existence. So if you are the surviving member of your family and the land that had been owned by your family for hundreds of years, those people would still be paying you an annual rent. And you can see how that would frustrate some people. Why am I paying rent to you? You're just a noble. Well, that's why you're doing it. It's a privilege to pay me. Second, donation of a share of the price received whenever the land was sold. So if you bought a piece of land that you're paying an annual rent, then you sold it to somebody else, you would have to give the noble part of that land price. And of course, the new people would then pick up the annual tax. Banalities. There are still places in France at this time where the nobles controlled all of the facilities for the people, the mill, the blacksmithing area, and other areas. So those are all fees that you add. The corvée, this is a French term for an unpaid series of days that you have to work on the Lord's land. Not everybody. Frequently, this is one member of your family, and it's not necessarily all the time. But they're going to grow crops for themselves. They're not farming it. The corvée, the people working the corvée are farming it. And if you have a good Lord, that's fine. If you have a bad guy, it's like, it's evil. I hate you. And then we have this hunting privilege. Nobles can hunt anywhere they want to. They don't have to pay any attention to property areas. Now, if you go on they're not going to go hunt on another noble's land because they get into trouble. But if they're in the process of the hunt and they're going over a regular person's property, they tear up your crops. Maybe they mistake your prize bull for an elk and shoot and kill it. Oh, we're sorry, we're not responsible for it. Or if you did take them to court, you would find that the noble who was in charge of the court was probably the same one who caused the problem on your land. So let's just say these are irritant. If you're a wealthy individual, you're an individual who's owning a business and you're not a noble, but you've been able to buy some land, and yet you have to give part of your money every year to that noble. It gets really frustrating. So these are some of the things that irk the people over from the Middle Ages against the nobility. Political reasons for the French Revolution. Well, they always talk about the despotic rule of the Bourbon kings. That they had unlimited power. Well, Peter the Great had unlimited power, Frederick the Great, several others. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're a bad person. The French, for example, Louis XIV did really well for the lower classes. So it kind of varied from place to place. It says no checks on power. Well, there's always a check on power. The military could always revolt. The people could then revolt as well, such as in Russia where you had the Pugachev Rebellion and the Thinkarazian Rebellion. But there are always some checks. It's not a kind of checks and balance like we look at with the American Constitution. Judicial, legislative, executive. Then you have letters of cachet. Now, if you notice the definition down here, letter to cachet, sealed letters. Letters are orders issued by the king under a royal seal, the cachet. Best known for cachet's use is to imprison or punish without trial. 18th century, they're often used and issued without names. You can just fill them in later. Now, this is abolished during the Revolution, you'll see in 1790. This is one of the things that really stirs the people up. Example of this is the Dumas story of the Count of Monte Cristo. He's in love with a girl, another man's in love with the girl who's a noble. He takes a letter to Cachet, puts this man's name on it, claiming that he is a threat to society. Because he's a nobleman, it has to be investigated. They bring him in, they arrest him, they put him in jail, they don't tell anybody where he's at. Then the document disappears, you lose the document, you just stay put. Ultimately, he's sent to prison, and then, of course, he escapes and does his thing. But the people of France, the urban legend in France was that if somebody disappeared, some nobleman had them put on a letter to Cachet, and they are then sent to prison. And everybody thought everyone was in the Bastille, which is why when the Bastille was stormed on July the 14th, 1789, they opened all the jail cells and let everybody out, all 7 people. So it is something that is unique, and usually, although the nobles could do it, they very rarely used it on another noble for the simple reason that that family also had that power. Now we have confused government. And in confused government, and if you remember, France is considered one of the best organized in all of Europe. The English would probably be pretty close. I think the English would probably have better accounting procedures. No budget. Well, I will tell you that there isn't a country in Europe this time that has a budget. They don't have a standard time for collecting taxes. Here in the United States, it's April the 15th. You either send them a check or file for an extension. In most countries, that's it would simply be a general time period or when the collector came by to pick it up. You're going to have laws vary from area to area. There are 130 different provinces in France, and so there are going to be variations, but you're going to find that in the different governments within Russia, in different areas within the English state as well. And the tax collection is irregular, and I've mentioned that there's not a set time. Sometimes it's delayed based on harvesting, but it's throughout Europe. To simply say that this is a problem strictly for France is not true. You'll even find the discussion about the cost of palaces, because the French did indeed spend a lot of money on palaces, but so did everybody else. St. Petersburg wasn't exactly cheap. Buckingham Palace and upkeep of all the various castles. Everybody has that issue. But you know what? In France, it's never more than 5% of the whole budget. 5% of any country's budget, that's pretty small. And you will find that if you looked at English outlays for palaces and other countries' outlays for palaces, they all fall in that 5% category. Now, if you looked at it with hindsight, you could say that's the best 5% investment that you could possibly make, because how many people visit Versailles every year and pay X amount of money? How many people visit St. Petersburg? It's the wars. The wars are always the thing that is the big political issue. It's a political issue, and starting them, why did you fight them? And then it's an economic issue because of the amount of money that you spent. There is no costlier project that a king can undertake than to conquer somebody. Louis XIV spent a fortune on trying to get Belgium and some other areas. And each country they need to expand. Under Richelieu, he was trying to make sure that France could expand because you had Habsburgs surrounding the country, and you had to break the Habsburg ring. So you have the costly wars, and the French had been involved in several of them. They'd been involved in the 7 Years' War, which is the French and Indian War. They'd have been involved in every other war that Europe had brought in, and many times during the Louis XIV's time period, it's all the rest of European countries ganging up against the French because of the size of their military and the size of their population. To some extent, confused government, if you just want to look at it that way, but if you compare it to other countries, sometimes when we do, and when historians do lists of what causes a particular problem, there's a lack of, well, is it that way somewhere else, or is it just here? So those are some of the political reasons. I think you could probably put another piece in the political, which really more or less falls into the philosophical section, and that is at this time period, the 1700s, we've had all this new thought coming out. The idea of checks and balances. Now, I know that Montesquieu is responsible for that, but if you read it very carefully, it is not like the United States. Yes, there's an executive, judicial, and legislative, but in Montesquieu, the legislature is the nobility, and the executive is the king, and the judiciary are the third estate. And you're only supposed to let the judicial work as a last resort. So it's not really the same thing. But you do have two sources. You have the American Revolution story, where they became free and went democratic, but it's more like separating a province that's thousands of miles away from the country. We didn't change England's government. We just broke away from England's government. But in England, you have a constitutional monarchy because the power of the nobles in the parliament were able to check the power of the king. And those ideas have become very popular. Voltaire wrote about the way England was operating. Other people talked about the English system. So the governmental issue, there are going to be some people who want a democracy, and there are going to be some people who don't want to get rid of the king. They want a constitutional monarchy. The economic reasons for the French Revolution. But these are items that were building up during the whole Ancien Regime. There'll be a different list that triggers the actual revolution itself, because these have been going on for a while. You notice the top of the middle class. Rise of the middle class. Now, the middle class is the business community, the trading community. They were not nobles. They were taxed. They were lawyers. They were doctors. They were all sorts of other people. When you get to the revolution, and you look at the people who are running the Estates General for the Third Estate, they're all from the middle class. And quite frankly, one of the things that you have in the French Revolution is a collision of the middle class, their ideas, with the ideas of the nobility. they're opposed to mercantilism. Mercantilism is a government system of economics where you have government monopolies. Sometimes they do wage and price controls. If you're a worker, wages appear to usually be at the low end, and the prices tend to be at the high end. So they're wanting more of a free market system to some extent. The big deal is the inequitable tax system. You have the direct taxes. These are things that everybody paid. The tie, the tax on real estate and property. And the thing about the tie, the amount of money that you pay is determined by the assessor that comes to your property, which means that that's very prone to, shall we say, bribery. You could have two people with the same property and pay two different prices. Somebody who maybe bribed them, somebody who didn't. I remember one time when I was growing up in southern Missouri that we did indeed have the property tax guy come by once or twice, and then they did away with it. But my favorite example of it is I was staying one night at a friend of mine's house, and his family lived out in the country, and they had cattle, sheep. And normally what he would get is a piece of paper that asked him to list the number of head of cattle he had, the head of sheep that he had. So one Saturday morning at 8 o'clock, there's a pounding on the door. It's the assessor. And I can still hear David's father's profanities as he goes down the hallway to open the door. Because the night before, they had just gathered up all their cattle and all their sheep, and they were all in the pen. And so there's going to be a big increase in the amount of taxes that they're going to have to pay. There's a head tax, a poll tax. There's a standard income tax, 5% to 11%, which most countries would consider very reasonable. The problem with the income tax is the upper classes, they don't pay. The nobles don't pay. The church doesn't pay. Then there's the indirect tax, which is the Gabelle salt tax. And I'll show you the specifics of that a little bit later on. But the salt tax is not unique to France. It is one of the ways that all governments throughout Europe use to get a consistent amount of money, because you need salt in order to live. Now, sometimes you go, well, okay, well, that's a lot of taxes. But if you think about it, here in the United States, my taxes are, from a direct tax, we have sales tax. Do I pay real estate? You better believe it. I pay taxes on my car. I pay taxes on my house. And do I have a head tax or a poll tax? I do not. I do have an income tax. And last year it went from 15% to 24%. And I didn't make any more money. They just changed the structure. The nice thing about the property tax is usually there's a mathematical formula, but this year that's been completely out of whack. Indirect taxes, we don't have a salt tax. We have license fees. We pay gasoline tax. So you always have to remember when you're looking at tax structure, how does this make the people unhappy? And I think we could look at that and go, you know, I would hate the person next door pay less taxes on the same or bigger house than mine, just like they did in the French Revolution. And I would like people to pay their taxes. I think most people today get upset when rich people don't pay taxes. So the same is true here. You can see that dislike. And then when you factor that in with the feudal changes that had not taken place, you can see why the nobles get in a little bit of trouble. Now here's the official definition of the tie. I just put it in here so you could see it for yourself. All you need to know is a very simple thing that I gave you. Tax in France, it took two forms, personal and real estate. That's it. Provide a greater part of taxation under the Ancien Regime. Personal tie, direct tax levied from the 15th century to 1789, was assessed on personal possessions at a rate that was arbitrarily determined by the tax collector. In practice, it fell almost entirely on the peasants because the first and second estates and some of the third estates were exempt. The real tie was levied over a similar period from the middle to the southwest of France, fell on common land. Less arbitrary than the personal one, it did indeed raise more revenue. The government's got to raise money. This seems relatively fair. Then you have the Gabelle. Here's the salt tax. And again, that's all you would need to know is the salt tax. You see when they started it, Philip the Fair in 1286, it's abolished May 19, 1790. So we're getting some there's going to be some tax changes with the revolution. So there's a plus side. And as we get into that, you'll see there's a bloody side and there's good things that come out. The word originally applied to indirect tax, but it was later restricted to salt, and that was a royal monopoly. All salt made in France was sold at a price fixed by the government. And some areas had to pay twice as much as others, and everyone above above the age of 8 had to purchase a minimum quantity of salt per week, produced 38 million francs. The philosophical reasons are just discussions of different philosophies. Most of these people really did not participate in any way, shape, or form other than written discussion of some ideas. Now, John Locke's case, John Locke and Hobbes are the two men who defended the two sides in the English Civil War. Hobbes believed that the king had absolute power, and the question of his power was against God's law, and the king was responsible for becoming a Leviathan to defeat any challenge to his order. Locke believed that the people had the right to protect themselves from the government if it attacked life, liberty, and property, which we frequently refer to as natural rights. And he supported the parliament that was attacking King Charles. Those ideas, particularly Locke's, then went to America, and we incorporated them quite a bit, along with the philosophy of Jefferson and all the others. Then you have Voltaire. Of course, Voltaire believed that government was a necessary evil, but should be limited to the enforcement of natural rights. And his would probably fall in the same category as Locke, but he would not suggest that the government be changed from a king, that it just should be limited in some way, shape, or form. Montesquieu talks about a democracy and separation of powers. And I mentioned this before. The separation of powers is executive, judicial, and legislative. The executive is the king, so there's no change in leadership. The legislative is the nobles. They're running the country. And the third one is judicial, which is what the third estate gets to use sparingly. It looks more like a constitutional monarch than a direct democracy. In American history, our checks and balances are more closely associated with the Roman Republic, where you had the plebeians versus the patrician. I would also note that in the same book that Montesquieu talks about separation of powers, he talks about how the government of a country is determined by the climate that they live in, that you could only have a democracy in a temperate zone because the climate wasn't too hot or too cold, so you could think straight, but in a hot climate, you needed a dictator because the people were uncontrollable. And I think where the philosophical piece flows more into the French Revolution is the examples of the success of the American Revolution. I mean, the leaders of the American Revolution are gods in the French Revolution. There are Americans who are in the assembly. There are Americans who tried to save Louis by offering the United States as exile. And one, Thomas Paine, got to be such a troublemaker that he was actually sentenced to be executed at the guillotine. The only thing that saved him was an accident. When they took him and the other 40-some people who were sentenced to be executed, they were taken to a local prison. He was taken down a flight of stairs to a landing. There was a door number 9. Him and a bunch of people were put in there. The jailer put the names down, and the rest of the people went down below. It usually took 48 hours for the death notice to be copied, so they had plenty of records. When they were ready to execute him, the men went down the steps. Going up and down the steps had loosened the nail on the 9. It had slipped down and was number 6. I'm sure the people were pretty sure that was room 9, but it said 6 as far as they were concerned. They weren't taking any chances. You can work it out later. I'm not going to make a mistake that's going to cost me my life. Fortunately for Thomas Paine, before the day was out, the American government was able to release him and take him back to the United States. At any rate, the immediate reasons for 1789, for the revolution to take place, we've looked at all of the different topics that were broad, that covered the whole period of the Ancien Regime. But most of them fall into this economic problem. That's what's going to trigger it. If you have bad harvests and you have high unemployment and the government is nearly bankrupt and the government is unable to do anything, that's a pretty good indication that the pitchforks are going to be sharpened and they're coming for somebody. Somebody's going to get blamed and a big change is going to take place. So in this economic problems, even though it says A, it's really the main basis, and these are subsections of it. Let's talk about harvest. From the time of Louis XIV under Colbert, who forbid the export of food from France, the French people overproduced food, which meant that they had as cheap a price of food as you could get anywhere in Europe, and even the poor people ate well. So how can you have one? Why would one bad harvest do any problem? Well, they didn't have one. They had 3 consecutive bad harvests. So there's actually a food shortage. How much is it? If you're in Paris in 1789, the price of food to feed a worker so that he could go back and work the next day was 90% of his daily salary. So you can imagine the starvation and the famine that's threatening. Unemployment, the economy is down. Unemployment in the cities and the factories factories is frequently 30, 40, 50%. Usually once you get over 20, 25, the natives get restless. Now, if you're in the rural area, you're working yourself to death trying to get a better crop, and you have full employment. But when you're in the cities, you have these congregations of large numbers of people who are upset. That's riot action. The government is almost bankrupt. They've been that way for a long time. Going back to the disaster investment in paper money by the Duc d'Orléans and the Louis XV, and then the wars and everything else, and the inability to have any of the people, whether it was Turgot, Necker, Cologne, any of those people, to get the nobles taxed. Nothing was going to change. And it's the stagnation of the government that what do we do? What do the people do? This doesn't work. Nothing's happening. How can we get change? Louis XVI then made a great decision, and he actually made a decision that everybody wanted, and that's saying a lot. The high clergy, the low clergy, the nobles, and the Third Estate said, please call an Estates General. Now, an Estates General, there's the technical definition, and he called it, Louis XVI called it, but it's an effort to reform the French government and the system of taxation. This is an emergency parliament, is what it is. I think the last one had been called in the 1600s. And you see, they have a voting procedure so that the body they have representatives from the First Estate, the Second Estate, and the Third Estate. And of course, by calling this, you have this incredible event that takes place in the country. This is called in 1788. If you look at 1788, you see the Parliament of Paris, which is the nobles' parliament. They present a list of grievances that they want the government to address because the nobles are trying to pressure Louis XVI to give in to their demands. You have riots at Rennes, riots at Dijon, riots in Pau. Then, on August the 8th, he summons the Estates General. Now, you just can't call it and have it show up the next day. So what takes place is the departments, as the French call them, they're all going to have internal elections. There's X number of representatives from each of the departments, and there's a representative from the First Estate, the Second Estate, and the Third Estate. So each of those groups within that department will then have an election to pick their officials. Then those officials were then supposed to show up on May 1789 and fix what's going on. In addition, you notice that on August the 27th, Louis XVI recalled his finance minister, Jacques Necker, as Minister of Finance. So they're going to try and work something out. Necker's excellent, but he's been stopped by the same thing that has stopped every attempt to fix the situation since the beginning of Louis XV's reign. The Parliament of Paris will not allow the nobles to be taxed unless they get control. Now, you notice the very last thing, and this is to some extent ominous, but you don't realize how ominous it is until we get to the next unit. September the 25th, 1788, the Paris Parliament, that's the nobles, recommends the Estates General should be constituted as in 1614. What that means is, how do all these people vote? There will be more representatives of the Third Estate than there will be of the First and the Second Estate combined. So if you vote by numbers, the Third Estate will get to do what it wants to. But that's not what that's not what the historical record shows the parliaments, how they voted. In 1614, they voted by class, which meant there were 3 votes. You've got a vote for the majority in the First Estate, which is the clergy. Then you got 1 vote for the majority in the Second Estate, which is the nobility. And then you got 1 vote for the Third Estate for what they wanted. So if you have high clergy and low clergy, and there's usually more high clergy than low clergy at these meetings, that means that the nobles have the upper hand and the Third Estate can't win. But that's not going to be present until right at the time of the Estates General, because the people are so desperate for change. They so believed that but what the king did was the right thing, and that this is what they wanted to do, that everybody would do the right thing to save the country. They did not believe that one faction would take advantage to take power. But that's what we're going to be looking at. There'll be a warning in January of 1789 from Abbe Sieyès, but we're not ready to talk about Abbe Sieyès yet. This is part 1 of 4 parts on the French Revolution. Again, those who are in my class, History 134, you simply go to citizengracchus.com and look at the section. There's I think it's a little simpler version of the PowerPoint presentation that you have here.